Hello and welcome to Literary Prospects. I'm Kelley Vick, your host, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest. Author Kristen Loesch grew up in San Francisco. She holds a BA in history as well as a master's degree in Slavic studies from the University of Cambridge. Her first novel, The Last Russian Doll, was a finalist for the Edgar Award and has been published in 12 territories. Her sophomore novel, The Hong Kong Widow, is out now. Kristen lives with her family in Switzerland. Kristen Loesch, thank you so much for being here today to talk about your spellbinding new novel, The Hong Kong Widow. Author Kate Quinn says The Hong Kong Widow is a tour de force, tense, emotional, poetic, and utterly unputdownable. Kristen Loesch is a major talent, and I can't wait to see what she does next. Author C.J. Cook says, a stunning, addictive, genre-bending book that will sink its claws into you from the very first page. I was utterly spellbound by this tale of a haunted house seance contest that interweaves historical narratives of a child medium and a mother returning to her haunted past. I don't know how Kristen Loesch does it, but she has a new superfan. Author Elisa Hooper says The Hong Kong Widow is a delightfully creepy shapeshifter of a novel. No one is who they seem in this braided narrative that is part ghost story, horror tale, and gothic thriller set against a fascinating period of history. I dare you to read before going to bed. And one more. There's so many, but author Amita Parekh says, this is more than just a historical thriller. It's a powerful testament to the enduring strength of women and the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to be broken by history. This is a beautifully crafted novel, unlike anything I've ever read. So, with that, Kristen, thank you so much for being here. And what can you tell us about the book? How would you describe The Hong Kong Widow?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for reading those kind words from all those authors, which is still so surreal to hear. It doesn't even feel like they're talking about me or my book, honestly, but thank you. So the Hong Kong Widow is a historical Gothic thriller. I like to call it a Gothic saga, but that's just me.
Mm.
And it's about a young woman in 1950s Hong Kong who enters a seance competition in a haunted house. And the events of that competition eventually become urban legend decades later. And she, as an old woman, goes back to investigate what really happened.
What was the spark that started this story for you? This sprawling story.
There were a few amazing sources of inspiration. So the first, and I do mention this in my author's note, but I want to say to all readers, do not read my author's note before you read the book. One source of inspiration was my grandfather's early life. So he was born in northern China in the 1920s. He did not have a birth certificate. And we didn't know a lot about his life until he was much older. And I think my grandmother at that point got him talking about it a bit more, but it was shrouded in mystery for many decades. He didn't like to talk about it. But like the main character May in the book, he did leave his home village for Shanghai, and my grandfather also fled the mainland eventually for Taiwan during the Chinese Communist Revolution. So that was definitely an early source of inspiration. I knew I wanted to use my family history. I was really interested in it. I was really moved by it. And one of my biggest regrets now is that I didn't ask my grandparents more when I think they had reached a period of their life when they were more willing to talk about it.
Mm.
And maybe I just didn't know enough to ask. So this is dedicated to them, and it was really meaningful for me to draw on that history. But there were definitely other sources of inspiration as well. One of them was a short story I wrote back in 2021, I think it was. It's a 200-word story, so really, really short. And I think it's actually a single sentence. Like it's one of those kind of
Wow.
semi-experimental flash fiction pieces. And it's about a girl who just swims across from mainland China to Hong Kong and crawls up on the beach, and that's it. There's only 200 words, so not a lot of space. But I named that character May. And that story, which was eventually nominated for a pushcart and became a best microfiction winning story, I felt like there was more to that character that I wanted to explore. And she
Mhm.
probably had this kind of her own backstory that I just had no idea of because I'd written this tiny snapshot of her life. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to make her the main character of this novel, and I'm going to find out sort of everything that I didn't know when I wrote the original story.
Oh, that's fascinating. How long ago was it that you wrote the initial short story? And then how soon after did you start work on this novel?
Sure. So the very first draft of the short story would have been just a couple notes in 2020 when I first started dabbling in short fiction. And
Mhm.
at that time, I was writing short fiction specifically to get away from my first novel draft as a sort of coping mechanism. And I really didn't think it would necessarily go anywhere, but I guess probably a lot of writers know this. You just have a lot of ideas, and most of them aren't going to go anywhere, but sometimes you want to keep track of them anyway. And then in 2021, I turned it into a fleshed out, if you can call 200 words fleshed out, version of that. And I thought, okay, now I'm more deeply involved in the short fiction world. I think I know a place where I can send this. And so I sent it to a literary journal known as Flashback Fiction, which
Mhm.
specializes, at least it did at the time, in publishing historical flash. And they accepted it. And I think at that time, I was also starting to think about what my second book was going to be
Mhm.
because we were going on submission in both the UK and the US. And at that point, I was like, well, I need a new project. I need to think about something else to get my mind off. And that's how it got started.
That's incredible. I love that. Um, we heard in the blurbs that this is a shape shifter of a novel.
Love that word.
It's hard to say though.
Yeah.
Um, and you've called it a historical Gothic mystery or saga, which all feels accurate. Can you talk a little bit about what that means, how you came to this style of essentially kind of blending three genres for this novel?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, so it is obviously historical. That's kind of the easiest umbrella to put over it because there's narratives that take place in the past. So that's nice and simple. I think the Gothic element really it's a stylistic choice. So I'm bringing in elements from classic Gothic literature that I really enjoy and really loved going back to, my childhood and sources of inspiration when I first started writing novels in general. Um, and then I've noticed that I like to kind of draw a little bit of everything in. So it's not even, I would say, just a historical Gothic thriller. I'm sorry to say, not to be confusing, but it has also a little bit of a love story. It's also kind of this family saga. It's also, in a way, a coming of age story because there's one narrative that takes place when the main character, May, is a child and she's growing up in Shanghai. And I know for a lot of people, that's a narrative that they really, really connected with.
Mhm.
So it's a really important part of the story as well. So it's got all these different elements, and maybe I just like to make things harder on myself. I don't know. But as a reader, I definitely love to read genre blends.
Mhm.
So I love historical horror. That's probably one of my favorite genres. There's a little, there's a horror element for sure to the Hong Kong Widow
Oh yeah.
as well. So it's not always the easiest to define, but I just love it when it all sort of comes together and you feel like, okay, this is exactly what this story needed to draw on to make it a whole.
Yeah. Speaking of blending together, and you mentioned our three timelines. There are three timelines. Modern day, 2015, um, 1950s Hong Kong, and late 1930s Shanghai. And we get the same character, May's point of view in all three of the timelines, but two of them are written in the first person.
Ah,
And one, the part in the 1950s Hong Kong where our potential murderous evening occurs is in like a close third person. So how did you make the decision to structure it in that way?
That is a fantastic question. You are the first person to ask me that.
Uh,
And I'm really glad you have. Yeah, so as you say, we see May at three very distinct points in her life. And I think of this as sort of three versions of May, of this one character.
Mhm.
And in May version one, when she's a child, she has this overarching goal. She wants to find her mom. We find that out very early on.
Mhm.
But, she has all the innocence of a child still. She's not really in pain. She's I would say happy in her way. She has this way of seeing the world that is full of joy, even at a time that, historically with what she's going through in her family life and politically and everything, there is a lot of pain and suffering around her, but
Yeah.
she brings that sort of childish joy to her view of the world. And then you have May version two, which is the storyline where she's a young woman and she's entering this seance competition and she goes to the haunted house. And this is where we get a lot more of the supernatural stuff as well, like the seances, obviously, and ghosts and this revenge plot. And that's because I think of May version two as being in a lot of pain. This is May when she's almost nothing but pain. In a way, she's kind of a human version of a vengeful spirit. There's a lot of discussion of vengeful spirits in the
Mm-hmm.
book. And then finally, we see May version three. And May version three is sort of a combination of those first two Mays in that, she's known pain, she's known incredible loss. But she isn't trapped in her memories the way May version 2 is in 1950s. She isn't obsessed with the past. I would say that May version 3 has even gone too far in moving on, that she's moved on so far that she thinks, oh, I should just forget everything. There's no value in what has come before. It's all about moving on and looking forward. And part of her character arc is investigating, how much is that the case and how much does the past have value, even if it's painful. And I think in looking at these three versions of May, I decided that the one who is farthest from herself and who doesn't know what she really wants the most is May version 2. This May in 1950s Hong Kong, who is obsessed with revenge and who has developed various coping mechanisms, as we see through the book, to
Mm-hmm.
kind of live a shell of a life. But really, she feels very empty inside and she doesn't really know who she is. She doesn't really know what she's doing there. And she doesn't even really know, in a sense, why she wants that revenge so badly or what she thinks it's going to do once she gets it. And that is why I thought, okay, I'm going to put her in third person to sort of symbolize and emphasize that removal from herself, that sort of she doesn't have the same self-awareness that even May version 1 as a child has, or of course May version 3 who is much, much older and has a lifetime of perspective. And so that was probably my first primary reason for making that choice. The second is far more mundane. The second reason is that I wanted to make sure the reader is always well situated in time and space and that they know which timeline they're in and which version of May they're hearing. And because it's always, I'm alternating chapters, I'm alternating timelines between the three, it was a little bit easier to help differentiate between two versions that were radically different, right? Number when she's a kid
Mm-hmm.
and when she's an old woman, and both of those being in the first person, but having one that was not in the first person so that we very clearly and immediately know, okay, this is May, neither of those definitely in 1950s Hong Kong, going up to Victoria Peak, seeking revenge. So
Mm-hmm.
that was the secondary reason. I hope that answers your question at
It
great length.
absolutely answers the question. And I'm curious, when you were working on this, were you working on all three of these timelines at once, or did you sort of write one through and then move on to the next one? What did that look like?
So I did a little bit of both. There were times when I went back and forth between different perspectives, and sometimes that selfishly that helps me as a writer
Mm,
because when you stop kind of thinking and writing in one voice and you move to the other, that can feel refreshing. That can feel like, okay, I'm doing something a little bit different now, so I can sort of step back, I can reevaluate, I can just take a little break from
Yeah.
that person's perspective, which can also be overwhelming, especially if you're in the first person and you're in this, the head of the character so
Oh,
deeply.
yeah.
But other times I wanted to write certain sections of each character going beyond what the normal chapter length would be,
Mm.
just to keep the flow going in terms of, what that character is thinking. And if I'm feeling like it's working really well and I've kind of hit a rhythm that I'm really enjoying in the writing, then I will do that. And I'm a really, really intense editor. So the first draft, the first few drafts are kind of an incoherent mess. And then I have to go back several times. And I think of it as just sort of how can I braid these three narratives together? So how can I make sure that they're interwoven in a way that is going to feel both satisfying and intriguing, but also not hopelessly confusing for the reader, which
Yeah.
is always the risk, of course, when you've got multiple timelines and, different perspectives and everything.
Was it difficult to, well, I guess I have kind of a two-part
Sure.
question. Um, because the early May May version one, as a child
Mhm.
is 7 years old, right, when we see her. And then we have the older May. So I was interested in capturing that child's voice and how that came to you, but also uh, bookending that sort of with the voice of the same person as an older woman. Was that what was that like, and how did you kind of figure that out?
I would say that that was a bigger challenge in my head than it was on the page. So I find even when just hearing you describe it now, I get a little intimidated at the thought of what it is I, have attempted to pull off in this book.
What you
I would
have pulled
say,
off.
thank you. That means a lot, actually. So with May as a child, this was interesting to me because I thought, and I still do think that there are certain inherent challenges in writing a child narrator.
Mhm.
And it is really, really tricky to get the tonality of it right and get the sort of, the innocence, but also the wisdom, because they're often so, they just have a way of looking at the world that is very precocious and very observant and very different from an adult. And I have kids, and at the time that I wrote this, my middle child was just a little bit older than May. So I would a little bit draw from her and just in her way of sort of looking at the world, things that they say that are very unexpected. And I try to inject some natural humor into there as well because I felt like not only does it balance out some of the heaviness of what is happening around Maine, what is happening in the book, and there are a lot of very serious and very dark themes being explored, that a little humor goes a long way.
Yeah.
But also because it is more realistic in that way. I felt like she wouldn't have lost all of her humor. She wouldn't have lost all her ability to laugh at that stage in her life. And I wanted that to come through. And I will say that once I'd sort of decided I was going to do this and I got down to writing it, it flowed wonderfully. It was
Mhm.
really, really a pleasure to write this character at the age that she was. And I would say it ended up being much easier than writing May as a young woman in the 1950s. I would say that May version one was the easiest to write,
Wow.
ironically, followed by May as an old woman,
Hmm.
and then finally followed by the 1950s version of May, who was the most difficult and whom I think suffered a little bit from being, the so-called main character. I mean, obviously it's the same character,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
she's kind of the central character. She's
Hmm.
got the plot that is focused on in the pitch copy, in the blurb. And I felt like I have to be careful with her because in a way she's not exactly unlikable, but she doesn't necessarily have a lot that people can relate to at the outset, being obsessed
Hmm.
with revenge and having gone through this incredible loss and, this with the historical background of the novel and everything. So she was a struggle. And I actually went back and forth, often writing sections of her narrative, this is 1950s May, in
Hmm.
the first person, and then changing them over to the third person for the
Oh, wow.
final version.
Wow. What what does your process look like when you first get that? that first idea that you're gonna move forward with this novel, are you a plotter or a pantser? How does it get from that idea to the finished product? And especially in a situation like this, when you're dealing with braided narratives.
So this has unfortunately been different for every single book so far. And in the case of the Hong Kong Widow, I had the original idea. I knew what I was, the time and the place, and I had my character, and I thought, okay, I can, loosely plot it just along kind of major beats and then take it from there. And I think that I'm a natural pantser in a way that I prefer to go on that journey of discovery as a writer as well. And I would have loved to to have been able to do that from start to finish with this book, but this book was under contract already. So I had various deadlines and I had people waiting for it. And in the end, I did have to plot out several sections in advance because it was getting so complicated and I was writing myself into corners occasionally.
Mm.
And in the case of my debut, I had way more time. So, I'd write myself into corners, then I just sort of write myself back out again. And I would explore this path and I'd be like, well, that doesn't work. But luckily, I have tomorrow to work on this path. So it was a little bit of a different process. And I think going forward as an author, I really have to find a balance for myself between plotting as I go along, which I enjoy so much, but which results in so much time wasted, honestly. And, he just reams of writing that it never sees the light of day. That I think in its way is enjoyable to write, but it's different when you're coming at it from a sort of professional career perspective versus exploratory, experimental perspective. And this harks back to what I was saying about short fiction versus writing the novel,
Mhm.
that it was nice at times to be able to write something that felt completely free of any constraints, where I feel like I can just do anything and there are no stakes here. But definitely, my process is still a work in progress, shall we say.
Do you have a daily time that you like to write or a specific routine?
Yes, I am very much into specific routines. I have three kids, and we are here in Switzerland, where kids typically come home for lunch every single day.
Oh, wow.
Yes, that is actually the norm here. I will refrain from further comment on that. But so
I can think of some comments. No.
I see them off in the morning and then I'm very methodical about it. I sit down, I check emails for usually about 15 minutes just to see if there's anything urgent that's come in. Usually there's nothing, but I do check, and if there's anything particularly, strange on my to-do list, then I might try to mark it off just to make myself feel better. But then I typically write until they come back around noon. And I
Mhm.
try to be really, really focused about it and just take a short break to go out in the garden about halfway through and sort of look in I have a little vegetable garden that I've started and it's always full of slugs. So I sort of go out and I get rid of all the slugs and then I come back in and I sit down until the kids come home. And then the mornings I feel like I try to reserve for writing and really try to guard those and not make any appointments, not, schedule any calls, really just keep those for writing. And then in the afternoon, I try to be more flexible, especially because my kids come home at random times and it's a bit of a mess. But that's typically my sort of really rigid half day versus kid dominated second part of the day.
Getting back to the specifics on the novel, we've talked about, of course, it's a wonderfully horrifying haunted house mystery at the center, but there is so much more going on here with the themes. Um, one of them being mothers and daughters and that relationship. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So this is one of the central themes of the book, as you've pointed out. And that's partly influenced by, I'm half Chinese. My mother is Chinese. And when I was younger, before I really knew anything about Chinese history per se, I watched The Joy Luck Club with my mother. So
Mhm.
obviously based on the novel by Amy Tan, which I had not read at that time. I was relatively young, probably too young
Mhm.
maybe to be watching The Joy Luck Club. But I watched it and I was really impacted by watching that film because I realized, that film is about that story, I should say, that novel, excuse me, not just the film.
Mhm.
It's about mothers and daughters. That is sort of
Mhm.
the absolute dominant theme in that. And it's about mothers specifically who are born and raised in China and they come to America and their daughters have such different lives than they do and such different perspectives. And it's difficult for them to, for both generations to sort of bridge that gap.
Mhm.
And I realized that, wow, my own mother comes from a place I don't understand at all, that I've never been to. I feel like, well, okay, I speak some of the language, or I, eat the food, or I, was raised very close to Chinatown, but that's different than actually knowing what it was like for my mom. And she would tell me stories that seemed really just complete fantasy. Like she used to go to school on a water buffalo, for example, and I was just
Wow.
like, what? you know,
Yeah.
and and then one generation further back, her mother grew up in Taiwan under the Japanese occupation. And my grandfather obviously hailed from northern China, as I said. And I realized that this is exactly what I was seeing in the Joy Luck Club and what I couldn't really put words to at that age, but I sort of inherently understood that there is this incredible gap that mothers and daughters can be so close in some ways and yet have so little inherent understanding of their own perspectives just because of how they grew up, the place that they grew up, and it's just so, so different. And that was something that was really meaningful for me to explore in this book. And I hope well, I'm glad that came across. That was
Yes.
important to me.
Yeah. What was your research process like?
So, research is always part of the fun for historical fiction and also part of the horror in a way. So I do love research, and this is a very different time and place than my debut, this one. And I didn't come into it with the same level of pre-existing knowledge that I did with my debut novel, which I had studied academically for several years. So I knew less, but I felt closer because this had to do with my own family history. So I would say that one of the primary resources outside of asking questions about my own family and going through old photographs and stuff is memoirs.
Hmm.
Memoirs are typically these primary sources are where you get a much better view, a much better understanding, I should say, of day-to-day life for people back then. It's much, much better than secondary sources. In fact, secondary sources are in some ways close to useless. I mean, you could just read encyclopedia articles that will just, give you facts and figures and dates and very, very high level developments, at sort of what is going on geopolitically and what are these armies doing and what is the emperor doing? It's all this sort of stuff that you can't translate that into a story about a girl growing up in 1930s Shanghai. You need to know sort of what she would wake up and do and what she'd be looking forward to and what she'd be thinking about. And those sort of details, the really, really mundane, boring, everyday details are ironically what makes a novel come to life.
Yes.
So I think for me, those primary sources and talking to family members were probably the most two valuable tools that I had as a researcher for this book.
Well, you also spent a year living in Hong Kong.
I did, yes.
And you described it as having a thriving and fascinating ghost culture.
Oh my goodness. Yes.
Can you share some of your favorite urban legends that you picked up on?
Yes, I can. I'm always a little nervous to do so because I'm like, how gory can people accept? So I will sort of err on the side of caution here. But definitely Hong Kong is the one of the best places, I think, to visit for people who are interested in ghosts, in spooky stories, in urban legends. It is one of those cities where just, you're walking just around every corner is a building with some sort of ghost story to go with it. And everyone knows it. And it's just amazing. And there's just lots of really cool and spooky places. And I think in that year that I spent in Hong Kong, I learned so much about Chinese culture, history, tradition, just everything. You don't know how much you don't know,
Mhm.
basically.
Yeah.
Um, but I will say that, so one of the urban legends that particularly influenced the Hong Kong Widow, and in the Hong Kong Widow, we know from the outset that there has been this seance competition, and the events of the final night is that their witnesses claim that a massacre has occurred, and the police come and they don't see any trace of a massacre, and they dismiss it as a hallucination, like a collective hallucination, a mass hallucination on the part of these witnesses, of which May is one.
Mm.
And an urban legend that exists in Hong Kong that I always thought was really, I don't think cool is the right word for it exactly. So I'm going to let the audience decide here.
Intriguing.
Yes, okay. Um, is there is, there are people waiting at the MTR in Hong Kong, at the train station,
Mhm.
and a girl falls in front of a train and the train hits her, and everyone sees it happen. The train driver, the everyone who's on the platform, they all see it happen. And then people, they call the authorities, and everyone rushes in to save her. Well, she can't be saved, but to, clean up
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
And they don't find anything. They don't find the body that the train driver says that he hit. They don't find blood. They have nothing. And meanwhile, everyone is insisting, no, it definitely happened. Like we saw it happen with our own eyes. And I think I I really loved that idea of a sort of
Yeah.
collective hallucination of that kind, I suppose.
Mhm.
And I think that, when you have one person claiming, oh, I saw it, then probably cold hard facts are going to rule the day. But if you have a lot of people, then it has this element of, yeah, it's just a little bit sort of jarring in a way that I can't really describe. That was one of my favorites.
And also the house, the Maidenhair house in the Hong Kong Widow is based on two houses in Hong Kong. Is that correct? A blending?
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. So there is one house that is on Victoria Peak, which is where I chose to place the house in the Hong Kong Widow, sort of up the mountain, because the mountain is very misty, very mysterious. It's also completely overrun by tourists. So, if you travel there and you expect like it's going to be completely gothic from the outset, like don't. But there is a sort of infamous house up there. And I think most of the stories, and probably all of the stories that are told about that house are patently untrue.
Hmm.
And but that doesn't stop people from telling stories because it is a gorgeous abandoned house. And if people Google Dragon Lodge or Dragon Peak Lodge, something along those lines,
Hmm.
they will see both pictures of the house, what it looks like. I think there are also YouTube videos of urban explorers who've broken in because you would have to break in to actually see the house, which I did not. I would just like to point out. But you can also kind of see it from there are walking paths going up Hong Kong, and you can kind of see it from the walking path. And it's just so wonderfully spooky and ominous looking, and I love haunted houses. It's interesting because I'm really, really chicken. Like, I don't think I could actually go into a haunted house. So it's the idea of haunted house. I'm basically the perfect reader for ghost stories because I want to be immersed in that scenario without actually having to leave the comfort of my own house.
Yeah.
And there was another house that I also found really, really intriguing. And I lived for a few months during my year in Hong Kong out in Yuen Long, which is quite far from central Hong Kong. And anyone who is listening who knows Hong Kong at all is going to be like, wow, that's way out there. So it's, sort of out in the boonies but still quite a bustling, busy place, just not what most people would think of when they think of Hong Kong.
Hmm.
And in this place, just a couple of minutes from where I lived, in the middle of sort of apartment buildings and warehouses and traffic, was this incredibly old, spooky, so-called haunted house that all the locals absolutely warned me. I don't know if they thought I was planning to break into it or I just, I was asking and kind of getting to know people, trying to be friendly, asking questions about local sites, and a lot of people brought it up. So I I guess in their way they're proud of it, and it is something to be proud of. It's a gorgeous house, or I think definitely it was in its heyday, and there's sort of a gate, part of a gate and part of a fountain. And you can go right up to it. And again, I did not go in. Very, very chicken.
Hmm.
But I have seen online that there was a woman who runs, oh gosh, I'm so bad with names. I don't remember what her name is, but she runs this sort of event festival type thing where she hosts dinners at haunted houses or so-called haunted houses or spooky places around Hong Kong. And she will go in there with her crew and she'll sort of fix it up. So it's still very run down and decaying and all that. It still keeps all of its atmosphere, but they'll set up a really fancy dinner for people. And then they will blindfold you, put you on a bus and sort of drive you out to the location. And I think they hosted one of these dinners at this house in Yuan Long. And that's probably also on YouTube for anyone who's interested. But definitely, if you see those houses, you'll know kind of why they remain a source of fascination.
What do you remember what the story was about the haunting of the house down the street from you?
Oh my goodness. I think it was that several maids had died. So I remember that detail. It was belonging to some sort of local businessman, and I'd have to go back and check the history. I think it's been a while since I looked up these houses, to be perfectly honest with you. But there was something about several maids who died. And if you read The Hong Kong Widow, you will probably see kind of where that element came into the book.
Mm-hmm. I'm sensing it. Um, have you always been a writer?
Oh, great question. I have always wanted to be a writer. There have been sort of periods, long periods when I went without writing at all. But I started out wanting to write when I was 9 or 10, and had a dream of being a published author. I think like many young avid readers have, and didn't really get back to it or start to do it seriously until I was an adult, until I was in my 20s and in doing a PhD and really, really disliking the PhD and sort of wondering what direction I was going to go in. And I did pick up some writing at that point and did a little creative writing summer school and realized that fiction was absolutely still my first love.
Mm.
And I had kids and sort of didn't jump into writing immediately, but when my kids were a little bit older and I was thinking, okay, you guys are toddlers now. I have a little bit of free time. What am I going to do with it? What am I going to work towards? And I remembered that dream and I thought, okay, I'm going to give myself some time to actually to work towards it. And I really, really love it. So I think, I try to separate my love of writing from being a published author. I think
Mm.
that there have been times since becoming published when I've not so much forgotten the joy of writing, but sort of let it slide a little bit in terms of I was letting external feedback and external stimuli influence how I felt so much that I couldn't write in the same way that I used to.
Hmm.
And I had last year, in fact, as I was redrafting The Hong Kong Widow, I had to take a conscious step back and think, okay, I'm not, going to fixate on the things I can't control anymore
Hmm.
because that will wreck me as a writer and that will take me so far away from what I love most about writing, which is getting this story that I have bottled up inside of me that I don't even know what it is, but I know that it has to come out, somehow.
Hmm.
And I need to get back to that in order to really be able to make this into a career because I need to find that sort of joy in writing. I need to rediscover my passion for it. And I had to do that really consciously in a way that I never had to do as a child or even, in my 20s. Now I had to do it as a published author. And it was a process as well. But I succeeded. And I feel like in the final drafting of The Hong Kong Widow, I enjoyed it so much. I loved it. I loved my characters. And when I hear from people that they care about May, it's like they're praising my child, honestly.
Mhm.
It's that same sort of the same sort of kind of overwhelming pride because I know that I put heart and soul into this book that I might not have been able to if I hadn't put that work in to get back to the joy of writing.
How did you get back to the joy? What did you do to help to recapture that and pull you out of that joyless direction?
There was a period writing The Hong Kong Widow, I think, sort of in the middle of writing it, when I'd finished a couple drafts of it and I knew that it wasn't working. And I felt like, I don't know if I know how to make this work.
Mm.
I was starting to let my writing problems sink into the sort of existential despair about how,
Mhm.
who I am as a writer. And I
Mhm.
realized it's not, there's no problem on the page that isn't fixable. There's nothing that can't be changed or edited. Well, once it's published, it's a bit too late. But at that stage, when you're writing, there's nothing that can be changed. And I felt like this is a sign that I've really lost my spark. I really lost my direction.
Mhm.
And so the first thing I did was I started to spend more time outside because I think
Mm.
I was spending a lot of time indoors, staring at my laptop, not knowing what to do, feeling frustrated. And when I was outside, and sometimes I would bring my laptop outside and just the fresh air and the kind of being outside and it being quiet really, really helped me. I listened to a lot of podcasts as well, and I not just writing podcasts, which I think I've always consumed and really enjoyed, which are really lovely, but different kind of podcasts, like this author podcast, for example, kind of podcasts where you hear other people talk about their inspiration, hear other people talk about their, what excited them as they were writing or what changed it for them in the writing of their book. And I found that to be more helpful for me at that stage than craft. And so I think that was when I started to realize I need to make a psychological shift. I need to make a change in my thinking and in my mindset. I
Mhm.
have to start thinking in terms of what am I getting out of this process and not just what am I trying to give to other people.
Mm.
Because as in the process of writing, you're emptying yourself already in a way. And
Mhm.
if you're doing it from a sort of scarcity mindset where you're like, I feel like I've, really reached the bottom of the barrel. I feel like I'm scraping for ideas. I'm struggling to sort of to figure out what it is that I'm trying to say. And meanwhile, you're not thinking about what do I need to recenter myself? What do I need to feel good about the writing process? And I discovered that having set routine helps. I discovered
Mhm.
that less social media often helps. My own inner critic loves social media because when you go on social media, you see writers who are, doing beautifully. You see people who are
Yeah.
just, everything is just coming up roses. And
Everything's great.
obviously, yeah. And obviously that's an illusion. That's what
Yeah.
social media is. But you have that part of your brain that uses it as an excuse to make you feel worse.
Yeah.
And that can often have an outsized impact when you're trying to tap into that creative part of your brain. And I realized that since my debut novel, I'd let the sort of outside clutter and noise fill up my head. And that, whether it was reviews or whether it was sales, all these sort of
Mhm.
external markers of success. And
Mhm.
then what had happened as a result is that I didn't have the blank canvas in my brain that I needed to be able for my creative mind to work.
Yeah.
I felt like I
Mhm.
have this creative part of me, but it needs like, just imagine an empty, a blackboard or just a piece
Mhm.
of paper. It needs that open space. It needs to be able to breathe. And it can't breathe until I get rid of all this other stuff that is cluttering up my head. And so that was what I focused on. And at some point, I was like, okay, I feel centered enough that whatever happens is going to happen, and I am ready to write.
Oh, that's great.
Oh,
That's it. That's really, thank you for sharing all of that. And that's such wonderful. Well, there's actionable advice and just also sharing that feeling that I'm sure so many people have, and especially maybe even when you're getting into that really what seems like the dream, it becoming the career, trying to keep that creative spark and keep the joy in it. Just knowing that people struggle with that, I think is really helpful. Speaking of the dream, though, initially, what was your initial road to publication like?
So, oh my goodness. So I wrote a contemporary YA novel, I think, as the first draft of a novel, as my first, not the first novel I ever wrote as an adult.
Mhm.
And I wrote it kind of not, really knowing what I was doing, but I finished it and I thought, okay, you look online and you see, oh, there's kind of a checklist for what you
Mhm.
do next. You query agents. I queried them and got nowhere. So I thought, okay, I need to kind of think about maybe a different project, starting something else. I had done my master's degree and my undergrad in various areas of Russian history, Russian politics. So
Mm.
I thought I'm going to write a book set in Russia. I'm going to make it historical. I'm going to make it a love story. I had all these sort of ambitions and ideas. The writing of the book, of course, always trips you up. But I did finish the draft and ended up querying it for a significant, quite a few months, I think. Looking back, I cannot remember exactly how many months, but I got an agent who works in the UK market.
Mhm.
And I had spent at that point over 10 years in England. So I guess I was thinking, I want to sort of aim towards that market. I really didn't know actually what I was doing,
Mm.
in case that isn't obvious. I was sort of just drifting back and forth between, this and then that, and not really knowing why one particular part of the journey has to come before the other parts.
Mm.
But so we went on submission in the UK and got an offer there. And it was only many months later that we went out on submission in the US via a co-agent. And that was how I ended up being picked up by Berkeley, my current publisher. And that's how it happened.
Is there a third novel in the works
There
now?
is a third novel in the works, yes. I can say nothing,
Okay.
but
Good
there
no
is
more, no more.
absolutely there is absolutely a third novel in the works. I think there's always going to be something in the works for sure.
What is your best or favorite piece of advice for aspiring authors?
Oh goodness. I don't always feel qualified to give advice to aspiring authors because I think I know that when you're in that first initial stage of things, you're getting advice from all sorts, and it's
Mm.
hard to parse exactly what is going to help you persevere the most
Mhm.
because ultimately perseverance at that early stage is the most valuable quality that you can have as a person. That
Mm.
ability to sort of not let your sadness over rejection turn into despair,
Mhm.
which I think is, there's always for everyone who succeeds there, I feel like there's always a lot of people who stopped at the step right before the success.
Yeah.
And I think in my view, getting used to failure early on is really, really helpful because
Mm.
there's just a lot of there's a lot of failure. It's an industry with a lot of failure. It's an industry with a lot of heartbreak.
Mm.
And I sort of think of it as like if you're a baseball player and you go through a cold spell in the minor leagues and
Mm.
you learn how to not do well and learn how to do actually really badly when people aren't really watching you, then
Mm.
that prepares you for the inevitable later failures when you're in the majors, as opposed to someone who is a superstar, ends up in the major leagues and fails for the first time, under the spotlight with
Mhm.
everybody
Mhm.
watching and doesn't actually know how to fail.
Mhm.
And that I think was something that I struggled with a lot initially, just starting out as a writer, especially when you're querying. That
Mhm.
is probably one of it feels more painful than later stages, not because later stages don't involve failure, but just because that is the first wall of
Yeah.
failure that you face.
Mhm.
And the more that it happens, the slightly less painful it becomes, or maybe I should say, the more you realize that you are more than those failures.
Mm-hmm.
And that realization is what will carry you through every single stage. And I feel like there are challenges at every single stage, and that there is no place at which a writer is actually thinking, well, maybe there are some very few, very few writers are thinking, I've completely done it. I'm an absolute success. There is nothing ahead for me, but I'm trending upwards for the rest of my career. And if someone does have that confidence, that's amazing. But I feel like that sort of confidence also comes from, what exactly have you struggled with before? Because the more you struggle, the better you become at the struggle. So that's what I would say. But also take it with a grain of salt, because advice is not necessarily always what people need at the querying stage. Sometimes you just need a hug. Sometimes you just need someone to jump into the pool with you, so to speak, and say, this is just really, really hard. And that's just it.
I think you're very qualified to give advice.
That's kind of you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
We have a traditional last question
Okay.
on the podcast, and it is, when The Hong Kong Widow is made into a movie or series,
Oh no.
what, what do you think the theme song should
Oh
be?
gosh. Oh, that's interesting. Oh no, I don't have a good answer for this question. Let me think. Let me think. Okay. Well, I'm going to go with the song that I listened to while writing this book,
Hmm.
because I am the sort of writer who listens to the same song over and over and over on repeat up to, hundreds of thousands of times, and that is Gravity by Vienna Teng. So that is a beautiful, beautiful song, and that was just on repeat for quite a while for me in the writing of this book.
Oh, now I'm going to go and find it and listen to it right
What an
now.
amazing question.
You. Thank you so much, Kristen Loesch, for being here. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.